Call to order the March 1st meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council Finance Committee. And Mr. Dayton, I believe you have the presentation.
We do. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Finance Committee members. Public Works is here to give you an overview on the Streets Fund and specifically the infrastructure funding. And as you recall, this was requested by the council that we come here and directed it to the Finance Committee. We're pretty excited about this opportunity to present those to you. Want to just look at the preliminary schedule that we've set out. This is not hard and fast, but this is our idea of how we might go about this discussion. And as you recall, or as you'll see on the slide, what we have for today is just talking about the background information, really understanding the budget. What do we have in terms of our revenues and expenditures, getting into some of the detailed activities that Public Works does with the Street Fund. And then really just looking at what potential topics we could have in the future here with the committee, talking about potential efficiencies that we could do or fund adjustments. And then eventually what we'd like to do is have some sort of recommendation from this committee back to council on what adjustments we could make. This is the outline of the presentation. The first part is we're going to hand it off to Bob Samario to really give you a background on the revenues to make sure you can kind of go over that again. I know it takes a while to get to understand that, and then review activities, some of the historic trends that have been happening over time in the fund, and expense review, and then talk about possible next steps. But this really launches our discussion on the whole topic. So, Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Finance Director. So yeah, I'm going to be going into the revenue details, and probably more detail than you've seen in the past, just so you can get a really good sense of how the revenues behave, what the projections are for the future, and why, in a sense, the way they behave is creating some of the problems that we have with the fact that they're just not keeping up overall with our costs. So we have the three primary revenue sources are Measure A, UUT, and gas taxes. And to the right, you see the biggest source of that is utility users taxes. That's 56% of the total at $7.2 million. That's half of the utility users taxes we get. The other half, as you know, goes into the general fund. And then the Measure A revenues, that's transportation sales tax, a half-cent that was passed in 2009 or 10. That goes for 30 years. And then gas taxes on the left. And I'm going to start sort of in reverse order. I'm going to start talking about each of these starting with the smallest, the gas tax at about $2 million per year, and this is based on the current year budget. So the gas taxes come to us in 5 different categories. These are all sections of the Highway and Safety Code at the state level. You'll see that they probably don't mean a lot to you in terms of what the section numbers, but to the left, in the green portion, section 2107, 38%, and then the second largest is bottom right, section 2105. And then 21% of the top right, that's the most recent one that came about in 2010, and I'll talk about that. But for the most part, I would say generally speaking, these revenues, these gas tax revenues are allocated to each city and in the state based on population. And that's really when you get down to one of the reasons that we are not seeing a lot of growth, is because our population has been pretty stagnant relative to other communities where they may be growing, then their gas taxes would also grow. So I wanted to talk about, sort of get into why we're seeing some major declines in our gas taxes, and we'll show you that. It's pretty dramatic in the last few years and what's being projected in the next couple of years. It has to do with what happened at the state back in 2010, when we used to have, prior to 2010, a sales tax that, the state had its 5% sales tax, we get 1%. And that was obviously a percentage of the total amount of sales. In 2010, and you'll see they changed that amount, but back before 2010, it was a 5% sales tax. And then below that, you could see that there was an excise tax that's imposed by the state as well, which was a fixed dollar amount. So it was 9 cents per gallon per Prop 111 that was established in 1990, and then prior to that, it was also 9 cents. So the federal portion, no local money, we don't get any of that money here locally or in California. So we get really the state sales taxes and then the state excise tax. However, in 2010, they changed that around. The fixed portion still remains, and that's one of the problems, as you know, the fact that it's a fixed dollar amount. It doesn't go up or down based on the price of gas or the use. But what happened was in 2010 is they implemented what's called a fuel tax swap, and what they did was they created a new section of the Highway Safety Streets and Highways Code 2103, and at the time they established it at 21.5 cents. And the reason the state did that, it was really to allow them to use the money they were getting to pay off transportation bonds. But the intent was that it wouldn't be fixed like the rest of the excise tax, that it would move, that so it becomes revenue neutral to the cities and counties. And so what they do each year, they make a projection in the future. What would we have gotten under the state sales tax at 5%? And they make a guess of that, and they establish the rate, and then the following year they true it up. And so every year they have this true up, and the second year based on what actually transpires in terms of actual gallons sold and what the actual price of the gallons were. Yes.
Councilmember Dominguez.
So the change then went from a state sales tax 5% of sale. Was that 5% of the sales of gas?
Yes.
And then the state excise tax. What is an excise tax?
It's a different kind of a tax, but it's a fixed amount. And again, it was initially established at 1.5 cents. But they, under this change, they did say that we'll make you guys whole. We don't want to keep this fixed amount. We want to make it vary, just like the state sales tax number. It's a variable number because it's a percentage of the dollar amount, whereas excise taxes normally aren't. But what they promise to do, and they are doing every year, is they're going to adjust it every year based on what we would have gotten had it been this variable amount. So effectively, it's a variable rate.
And that's 21.5 cents per gallon?
Initially, yes. That's what it initially was.
Thank you.
So this is the graph showing each of the sections of revenues we get, again, all population-based, and they're all fixed except for Section 2103. That's the variable amount, and you can see where it's just gotten up and down, but in the last couple of years, and where it's projected to be is dramatically below where we've seen in prior years. At its peak, it was over $1.2 million, almost 1.3. What we're projecting in the next couple of years is going to be $400,000 for this year and about $200,000 and some next year. So a dramatic decline, and the reason for that is because since it's ironically it's a variable rate, unlike the other portions which are fixed, it does go up and down based on gas prices and actual gallons sold. And as you know, gas prices have been dropping dramatically. And the reason we've also seen the big decline is because of this true-up I mentioned. They make an estimate of where gas prices are going to be and what the gallons sold, and they've overestimated. So not only are we seeing the real drop in the dollars, but because if they do this true-up, it's a downward true-up, and we're seeing the compounded impact of that declining gas prices. And they expect that to be pretty stable in the next beyond 2017 until gas prices really start to go up. So this has really hurt us a lot because over a few years we're seeing a dramatic decline in just that one revenue source. The rest of them have been pretty stable. I mean, because they're fixed and our population is pretty much fixed, we are seeing that they're relatively stable. So these are the actual and projected numbers for our various components of the gas tax. You could see in 2014 we generated received almost $2.9 million. Last year, 2.3. We're projecting to receive $2 million this year, but at $1.8 million next year. And you can see that the 2103, their last row, is where you see the dramatic change from 1.3 to $214,000. And I think some of you may have heard that the Board of Equalization, which establishes the rate under 2103, they did lower it beyond what was projected. So these numbers for 17 are probably a little bit higher than what they're going to be. Okay, so now we move, and I just wanted to point out that, this is in the wrong place, but this is how gas taxes statewide are allocated. I'm not going to go into this, but just to show you that it's a very complicated formula of how all the monies collected get allocated. And those are the portions that go into to cities and counties. So very convoluted allocation method. So next we're going to talk about, do you have questions?
Councilmember Dominguez.
Where does the federal fuel excise tax of 18.4 cents per gallon go?
I don't know. The answer to that is not part of this. I'm not sure what it goes for, how it's allocated.
If it ends up in streets or transportation somewhere, or if it goes to DC and ends up in healthcare, or
not sure. Okay. Not sure.
Well, actually, it does stay in transportation. It goes into the Highway Trust Fund at the federal level, and the amount of money that Congress appropriates for transportation funding to the states exceeds the amount of money that's in the Highway Trust Fund. That happened, I think, about 3 years ago. For the first time in history, they used general fund money at the federal government level to fill the gap in the Highway Trust Fund so that the allocations to the states could be maintained at the existing appropriation levels. So the same phenomenon that we're seeing in California with declining purchasing power of the gas tax relative to the needs is also happening at the federal level. And all of basically all of the federal gas tax goes back to the states and then gets plugged into the formulas that ultimately end up coming to cities and counties and state highways.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to Measure A. That's about 28% of the total revenues. And the way it's allocated countywide, and this is over the 30-year period, you see at the bottom right, it's about just over $1 billion. That most of that goes to the North and South counties, $455 million to each, and then $140 million is allocated to the Highway 1 widening along with other projects. And so the local portion on the South County, you could see how then it's allocated among the various sort of categories. The top represents how much money is allocated to cities for local streets and transportation improvements. That's 74% of the total allocation going to the South County. And then, and this is for in totals, and for 17, the projected numbers, you can see that for in total, what's going to be allocated to local streets and transportation improvements is $11.4 million. So that's just 2017's allocation. And this is kind of a forecast that SBCAG put together, starting with next year, the forecast through all the way to 2021 by jurisdiction. Ours is sort of highlighted in the middle, City of Santa Barbara. So 2017, we're expected to get $3.6 million. That's a slightly up from what we're seeing this year. And then in 18, it's going to go down slightly. Because that's when bonds are going to be issued and repaid. But you can see it goes up pretty moderately. They're projecting about a 3.5% increase per year, which I think is probably okay. But we've not seen that in the last year or so in terms of, because this is all tied to sales taxes. It's a sales tax number. It's generated and collected in the same way our sales taxes and the general fund is collected. The only difference is it's allocated on a population basis or a per capita basis. So it behaves in the same way. They're projecting 3.5%. That's probably okay. I worry that that's maybe too aggressive in light of what's happening with sales taxes in general and internet taxes and all that, or sales, I should say. And then the last one I want to mention is utility users taxes. And again, that's the biggest revenue source for streets funding at $7.2 million. So I just wanted to show you that utility users taxes are really collected from different sectors, and each one behaves differently. But overall, I would say that none of them are behaving in a way that's going to really provide us additional revenues, with the exception perhaps of the last one, which is water. But I'll go through these real quickly. Cellular, that's where we've been seeing a lot of decline. Folks are moving away from not only landline, but they're now starting to move away from traditional cellular services where you pay for a 2-year contract or you set up a 2-year contract. More and more people are moving to what's called prepaid. And in the old days, it used to be sort of you buy a track phone and you buy a card and you buy minutes and you add it to that. But it's becoming more sophisticated than that, where you can actually basically go to Verizon now or AT&T and establish what's called a prepaid plan. But the only difference is you just don't have a 2-year contract. You pay for the full price of the device and you just pay a monthly amount. And it could be for a certain amount of minutes and data and all that stuff. But there's still these sort of tier 1 or tier 2 carriers that provide just, you have a device and you pay a monthly amount for a certain amount of minutes and that's it. And in both these areas, it's escaped utility users taxes. We've not seen UUT applied. It's not been required. Liquor stores could sell these cards with minutes and the like. AB 1717 was approved and it became effective this past January, so just last month. And it does now require that all the folks like liquor stores, Walmarts, and even the carriers, that they start applying UUT to these prepaid services. It's a lower rate because a good chunk of that, or a fair chunk, goes to the Board of Equalization, since it's being sort of collected through that same infrastructure and system as with sales taxes. So we might get 4% instead of the 6% that we would get. So hopefully that down the road we're going to start seeing the turnaround in the cellular portion, where we're seeing the erosion and moving to prepaid. But that's not really starting to this year, and really because of the timing, we're not going to start to see the impact of that until next year. So when you look at the numbers from that first row, this in 15 we saw a 10% decline, almost 11% decline, just because of that shift. We're going to continue to see this decline in 16, but not as much because of a little bit of revenue we'll get starting this January. And then we're going to see a 6% growth projected, because that'll be a full year kicking in of AB 1717. On VoIP, that's a small number, so I'm not going to really talk too much about it. Telephone, just a steady decline in the landline, traditional landline telephone services. It's been on a decline. 2015 was relatively flat, but we're projecting a 1% decline, and then this year, and then a 2% decline next year. So just the trend is downward. Cable TV also similarly going down, but for reasons that a lot of cable now is online, so things are moving into the internet, if you will, video streaming, TVs, movies, and the like that we've talked about before. So we're seeing that as sort of a shrinking market. Electric is pretty stable. The rates are set by the PUC, and so we're not seeing a lot of volatility there. And this last year we grew at 4.7%, but we're projecting to be pretty stable over the next couple of years. Natural gas, you've probably been reading about the fact that there's such a glut in natural gas worldwide, but particularly here in the United States. So the prices, it's just sort of like with oil, prices are just going way down. So we're seeing that those numbers decline. We are projecting a flat next year, but this year and last year about a 10% decline. And then refuse and water, those are our own utilities, so we're seeing some stability there. Water, as you know, last year we saw more conservation than we expected, so that's why we had a 5.5% decline in the UUT related to that. This year we're projecting 4.14% because of the pretty substantial rate increases we've implemented this year. And then next year, about a 6% increase. But overall, I think you could see that, in fact, as this chart here shows, that since 2010, we've overall, even though each one sort of behaves differently, we've seen pretty much a steady revenue source. When it's not been increasing much, it's been pretty flat. Again, overall, this year we're expecting a 4.4% decline, but next year 2.2%. But just hasn't been keeping up with the cost of providing, particularly street services and related programs. So just the quick takeaways: all the revenues, just because of the way they're behaving and how they're allocated and how they're generated, we're not seeing them keeping up with the cost of providing the services in the streets fund. And I will say some revenues are in jeopardy, as I said, things like cable TV and even things like the gas taxes, the falling prices. I just think that they're sort of in jeopardy right now. The state is looking for ways to increase funding for infrastructure. We've talked about expanding sales taxes as a way to fund infrastructure. We work in Prop 13. The governor's budget proposal for next year, he issued that in January. It does include a proposed $3.6 billion transportation measure, and it's funded from an increase to the vehicle license fee, some cap and trade money, and just raising more taxes, the gas taxes. It would provide the city of Santa Barbara somewhere around $500,000 or more money. So not a lot of money, but it's better than nothing. So we'll see how that develops. So that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have on that piece.
So we'll go to the street fund activities, and just to give you an idea of some of all of the things is not all inclusive, but trying to get all the high points on the street fund and what we're doing. We've broken this list up to try to help make sense of the different aspects of the operation. Infrastructure being those things, those are the assets that we have in the field. We put traffic or transportation planning under the assets, the infrastructure, because what we're doing in transportation planning is we're projecting into the future about what our needs are going to be. And so that part of the team is talking about what we need in the future based on the carrying capacity and increasing growth of Santa Barbara. And then operations and maintenance, I think some of the things we have under here could go under either. We're trying to, under maintenance, talk about the things that are infrastructure that need to have attention and maintenance, but then other things that are under there that are a little bit maybe could go under both. Graffiti abatement, so something is getting sprayed and we take care of it within the right-of-way and on buildings that we own. Garbage removal within the right-of-way, shopping carts that are left in the right-of-way, encampments that generally are in the right-of-way, homeless encampments. Under operations, the Laguna Pump Station, maybe you might be familiar with that. That's down at the waterfront at the end of Laguna Channel, and we operate that. We put traffic engineering under operations, and that covers management of the operations of the system, the traffic signals and such. Street sweeping and the downtown waterfront shuttle, our operation cost, easy lift. The special event setup is mainly when we have parades. So when we're doing a parade and we're closing down State Street, there's a lot of barriers that need to be set and traffic diversion around those are the very big events, and streets is involved in that. The porta potties, or the portable toilets, refers to the ones that we have set up at Yananali at the labor line, mainly as a deterrent to going in the creek. And the land development review, that's also within transportation planning, but that's a different section, and we put that under other because that's reviewing land development applications. It affects the streets. In other words, we're making sure that when a building's going in, that it has the right access to the public right-of-way and the right future carrying capacity, but it's in other. And then the permitting fees, which is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System fee, which is about $30,000. We just have to pay that. If you have other questions about, there's people that can help about that are familiar with that fee. When we talk about all these activities and begin to talk about this, which is our discussion about the limited funds that Mr. Samaria went over, we think about the core services that we have and the non-core services that we have. And to kind of get around that discussion or see what that might be, I just put up the Public Works mission statement, which is providing the community with a sustainable foundation to thrive by delivering quality services and public infrastructure through efficient and fiscally responsible practices. When we talk about this, one of our mottos is we're at our best when you don't notice. When the public notices is when there's a problem with their daily lives and getting from point A to B in the street, and that's when they notice. We're doing great when no one notices us. So the core activities really relate to the streets and getting from, moving goods and people and services throughout the city and doing that well and high quality. The non-core services are related to other things that may be in the right-of-way, but are not directly related to infrastructure and maintaining that ability for people to get around. So what we try to do is try to begin to take those categories of street fund activities and identify which are the core and which are the non-core activities. So under infrastructure, I think it could be argued either way. But we put street trees and maintenance, median landscaping under the non-core. It's beautiful, definitely an asset to the city of Santa Barbara and a testimony to the beautiful city. But in terms of getting people from point A to B, not exactly vital. Operations, we have to have the Laguna Pump Station to keep the city from being inundated with water, and traffic engineering is a part of our core staple of being practicing a safe system. But then when you look at street sweeping, the downtown waterfront shuttle, and the Easy Lift contract. By the way, Easy Lift, just if you don't know, Easy Lift is a paratransit service that is in our community. It's very effective and good, that supplements the MTD bus service. So, and that's required by law, that the amount of money you spend on transit service must be supplemented for paratransit, which is more of a door-to-door service for people who can't use the bus. So that's what that means. Special event setups, not exactly core, and certainly not the portable toilets. And then under maintenance, street resurfacing, which has been a very, very big topic in the past, and about the amount of money that we don't have to keep the proper quality of street service going. Definitely a staple for us. And then the signage and keeping the paint fresh on the road is important. The storm drain cleaning, obviously important. We haven't seen the El Nino, but obviously if the El Nino showed up in that's big proportions, we need that. Versus non-core, graffiti abatement, garbage removal, shopping carts, and homeless encampment. They're very important to have, but they're not the non-core services. And then the other, as I explained before, land development review, not exactly core. So going to historical trends of street fund activities, and And this is kind of a really interesting thing for me to reminisce. Being, I've been here now 25 years, with the city of Santa Barbara. So, kind of being around when some of these things changed and looking at some of our non-core activities and how they have been added over the years. The graffiti abatement, which for the street funds takes about $250,000 of our attention. That used to be a general fund role that when in the recession, the Great Recession, we moved over to the street funds, and largely to prop up the general fund. Trash collection, the right of way. We're getting calls. When no one knows who to call about a couch or a dishwasher or a pile of trash, and they don't know how to handle the Marburg. So we get in the business of taking care of those things. And that amounts to about $35,000 when you talk the amount of time that it takes and the resources we use to do that. The toilets are about $20,000 over on Unanale Street. Street tree maintenance, the way we are doing that now is we give about $1 million a year to Parks and Rec, and then they maintain the street trees. That's the median maintenance has kind of been an evolving issue. We've handed that over to Parks as well. But as you know, our boards and commissions, when we do a transportation project, it has to be a Santa Barbara style, and so they're constantly asking for really great, robust landscaping, like in the center of a roundabout, for instance. Well, that has a real maintenance cost associated with it that carries out. The events and tear down, we're looking at about 50.
Councilmember Dominguez has a question.
Can I ask a question about the street trees? So you said you pay $1 million out to Parks and Rec, and then they do the maintenance?
That's correct.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Give me a little more of the history behind that structure?
Let's see, I'm going to be foggy on a lot of the details. The $1 million goes for folks in Parks and Rec that actually do the street trimming. And I don't know, maybe, here's Jill Zachary is here, who manages that program, can tell us a little bit about that history, maybe.
Council members, I just thought it was on. Sorry. I apologize. Jill Zachary, Parks and Recreation. We, through our forestry division, maintain both the street trees in the medians and the parkways as well as the trees in city parks. And so the UUT revenue, which I think last year was about $950,000, is solely focused on street tree maintenance. As for the history when it started, I actually don't have an answer for you. I'd be happy to come back with that information, but it's essentially the work that we do on an annual basis, and we coordinate closely with Public Works on that work.
I was just asking because that seemed like a pretty big number to go from one department to another, so I was curious if there was a reason it went that way rather than straight to Parks and Rec, but there's no real other source of curiosity beyond wondering why it kind of goes through two departments.
Okay, we'll come back to you with that, more history on that. The downtown waterfront shuttle and Easy Lift contracts. The Easy Lift contract was added when Measure A, which was Measure D, and it became Measure A. That was one of the agreements the city did to give extra amount of money. It's about $235,000 a year to Easy Lift as a way to enhance their ability to meet their needs. It's kind of in and above what MTD revenues are sliced. All the revenues that go to MTD, a portion of those actually go to Easy Lift for that paratrans. So that $235,000 is in above what is required that the city contributes. The downtown waterfront shuttle contract is split up between downtown parking and the streets fund. It used to be funded by RDA completely, and then over time some was sent to the downtown parking, and then now with the elimination of the RDA, now streets. So the streets portion is about $615,000. Land development review staffing is about 485,000. That is also, we do have some amount, about 35-40% is recaptured in the land development process through fees. And then the street cart.
Councilmember White?
Repeat that land development number again, please.
485,000.
485 minus 30% of that?
No, yeah, it's between 30 and 40% of fees that we recapture that. We're working on also increasing those slightly with the new budget. And then shopping cart retrievals is about 3,000. So these are some of the non-core activities that we've inherited over time. The event setup and tear down, as far back as we can remember, we've been doing it. And then, so we also have core activities that you would expect a streets division to be doing, but not doing. So when Public Works, when we're trying to do these core activities, they also have been changing over time. And with streets paving, that has been reduced over the last 2 decades. And as the funding sources have been shrinking over time, this trend is not new. It's continuing as the funding sources shrink. What we've done to accommodate that is doing less of the paving by not replacing some of the big equipment that we have. So we don't have an asphalt hopper or a way to crack seal in the streets that we might have had in the past. So we're doing less and less. So when we want to do a street paving to do some of that work, we'd have to rent that machinery. Storm drain cleaning, we really have done. We don't have the proper equipment for that. We haven't done it in a long time. So you have both the maintenance issue of the draining system that can fail, and then you also have the cleaning that's necessary. And for doing some of that work, we've been borrowing equipment from water resources, like a Vactor truck is an ideal equipment to have to clean the storm drain. Street lighting upgrades and maintenance, we have not done. We've been largely reactive on the maintenance on that one. We do have some reliance on land development. If a land development project is going in and we can get a new street light and upgrade the system, we will. But we don't have a comprehensive plan to say, okay, this is what needs to be fixed in the street lighting area, and going after that because of the lack of funding. And then traffic signal upgrades. We rely right now very effectively, but on safety grants to upgrade traffic signals. For instance, recently, when the traffic signal heads, the red, green, and amber lights are, the old style was 8 inches and the new style is 12 inches. The new standard is 12. So, for instance, that upgrading that we're doing now was done through safety grants. Moving from the walking man to the countdown timer, that kind of thing. The kind of the putting in an arm versus not in this city we don't have a lot of the arms that go across the street where the signal's in the middle of the street. So those kind of upgrades are safety grants. The problem with that is that you have to have a safety problem to get the grant. So it's not a proactive safety funded program. It's more reactive in nature. So with that, just to go over some of the expense reviews, and what this slide does, it kind of begins to tell the story of what are the more what takes up the lion's share of the monies and what is less. And we're not, on a previous presentation we gave you, we tried to total it. We're not trying to total it here, just to give you an idea of what is more and what is less. I will make some notes on this one. It looks like traffic signals is very, very expensive. And that is so expensive because that also includes the electricity bill for the lighting and the traffic signals, which is pretty high. It's about $650,000 for the annual electric bill. So that one seems a lot higher than it really is in terms of the work effort that we put into it. So this is useful for our conversation. And then this really tells us the story as to why it's important for us to be talking now. You know, we've Public Works has come to the council in the past with the bigger issue about street pavement indexes and the quality of our roads and the diminishing funds that we have that is the kind of the bigger picture. Now what we're talking here is more about, hey, the capital fund that we have is also diminishing and expected to come down to a place where we're not having a capital budget anymore because our expenses are increasing. And this tells that story by looking at the revenues that Bob talked about versus the operations and maintenance expenditures. And then the difference at the top, at the top is the amount that we either hold in reserves or we use in the capital for the capital program. So when you look at this, you can see that this gap is narrowing in the future, and that means that our capital is going down. One of the things to say about that is that although we don't have, although we're getting a diminishing capital program, it's also important to note that we have a lot of other funding sources that are grant funded. So, for instance, we've been very successful with pedestrian and bicycle grants, and we have the bridge fund that we're replacing through the state. So, while it seems like we're really busy, and that those things will make it seem like we're really busy, the actual capital program is diminishing. So here's the summary slide on that. The trends, as Bob pointed out, the revenue's flattening, some decreasing, salary and benefits are increasing, and that is a lion's share of the folks that are doing the work. So when that price tag goes up, that gives us less money, and then allocated costs outpacing revenues, and then this, as I explained, just last diminishing funding for non-grant funded capital projects is the issue. So that's the end of our presentation, and we'll entertain questions on that and begin this discussion. I also want to note that we promised we would bring the LAC report regarding streets to this group to vet that, and we could do that in future meetings.
Questions from council members? I've got a question. There's a different slide from yesterday about Streets Funds review expenditures by program. This slide from yesterday had a line item from Transportation Administration that isn't on today's slide. Is this a mistake, this other one from yesterday, or is that?
It's not a mistake. The Transportation Administration is, let's move that up to that. The Transportation Administration that we had on yesterday's slide has both allocated costs and the street tree, forestry money that we pass through, and we wanted to break that out to make it a little bit more clear.
Okay, got it.
So it's broken out on this. If you take allocated costs and then the
street trees,
and you add those together, you get the
transportation. So it's just really kind of a poorly chosen heading for that.
Right.
It didn't describe it.
Trying to make it more clear.
Yes. Okay. Good. You know, if you looked at grant-funded capital projects, what would the trend be for that? And what would be the order of magnitude of that in comparison to? Because, clearly what's happening at the state level is that the state has decided it knows best how to spend transportation dollars and is specifically programming those funds to meet its agendas. And we're an aggressive grant recipient of those programs. But I need a sort of a sense as to how much money that is in relation to these other things, because that's clearly an increasing funding source.
Well, as you know, with the capital program, money for capital program diminishing, we are going to really up the game to do that. And so I would say it's getting more successful. I think with the ATP grant, the Active Transportation grant in particular, because that is a statewide grant that we didn't have to rank our projects. Every one of our projects competed statewide, if you understand that. In other words, it wasn't a proportional by population choice.
Right.
And a lot of people didn't understand that, and we did, and that's why we did well. We got, 8.3 million is quite a bit of money there, and so we did best per capita in the state, and we can't guarantee if that trend will continue. So I think I think the answer is we'll do our best to compete. But whether or not it's an upward trend over time, I don't think we could say.
Well, not just the ATP funds, but like the safety grants, all the other grant programs. If you added all those monies up and you divided them, in the last couple of years, that's obviously a significant number. And like you said, it might be an outlier number. But in looking at the whole capital picture, we don't get to necessarily choose our highest priorities through that process. That's a different way of doing business. I don't think it's the right way to do business, but it is the way that the state's doing business. So, but I need to understand that in context of what we're talking about here, because $8 million for the Active Transportation Program grants is 4 times what we're spending on the capital program. So it's much, much bigger. If that were to continue for 10 years, we'd have a lot of stuff built. Might not be our priority, but it would be a lot of stuff on the capital list.
Chair Hart, Rebecca Bjork, Public Works Director. The one of the concerns that we have is that the things that are eligible for grant funding tend to be improvements.
Right.
And what we're struggling with is how do we maintain our basic infrastructure. So although we have been very successful at providing really great improvements for transportation, particularly alternative transportation projects like sidewalk infill, bicycle, and safe routes to schools, there just are not grant programs for general pavement maintenance, either sidewalk or roadways. And that's one of our biggest expenditures if we were able to fund it properly.
I think this is one of the more challenging parts of this problem, is explaining this to the public. Right. Folks drive by, they see things being built. They see things being built in the city, and they assume that the city's doing those things, and we are, but we're doing it with state grant funds that are on a competitive basis. So it's not, as you said, we don't have the choice to use those monies on paving the roads.
And the things they don't see, like the storm drains, you just don't see those. And the other thing that we didn't say that's important is all those grants have matching funds that are required to get them. So without a capital program, we don't have matching funds to actually capture those.
That would be helpful to understand that in more substantive way, that what percentage of our funding is going to go after the grants to leverage that extra dollars. Is it a modest amount of money in comparison? For example, I think it's 90-10 on the bridges, so it's a relatively small amount of money in comparison to what you get. I don't know what the Active Transportation Program matches are. Similar percentages, I think.
You decide, and then that you compete on how much you're
going to leverage to make your grant more competitive. Safety grants, is it the same thing, or is that a percentage?
The safety grants, it's more about how serious the safety issue, and that also depends upon the volume of money. Like if someone was to die in that section, then you get the most money. But
yeah,
you can see that's kind of a conundrum.
Let's see. Any other questions? Councilmember Dominguez?
Thank you. Going back to follow up on Greg's question with allocated costs, I'm used to that in the accrual-based world, but here, how are you using allocated costs, or what does that mean in this slide?
Well, I'll start that, but may need some help from Michelle. Okay, you want to do it? Okay.
So allocated costs are those that are charged from basically the internal service funds, so facilities, fleet, information systems, so our computers, our risk management operations, all of those are central services. We call them ICS funds, and they charge every single fund and department for the benefit they receive. So at you'll see that anywhere, general fund gets allocated costs as well. So that's what it is. It's things that they really can't control, other than to the extent they can control how much space they use in a facility, how many computers they have. But things like the liability program, workers' comp program, those are all based on formulas and actuarial studies and all that. So it's a number we give them in finance, and but it doesn't change from year to year. But that's what it's for.
So another question I have is, so when you say allocated costs outpacing revenues, how is that in layman speak?
if you think about where those costs come from, they are related to, again, staffing for the most part in information systems, in risk management, and costs related to those services. So risk management costs we know are going up because workers' comp claims the magnitude is going up, liability claims are going up. So how much they get charged is it may vary, but at a minimum, it's going to be tied to staffing in those areas. And we typically see a 3 to 5% increase each year because of not only salaries, but because of other benefits like retirements or retirement and health insurance. So we typically tell people assume about a 3 to 5% increase every year in those allocated costs. But as you see, the revenues that are coming into the streets fund are not growing at that pace.
And those are revenues you're receiving from those departments that you're charging for those services?
So the revenues I'm talking about are the revenues we just went over in the streets fund. So they're relatively flat, you see historically, but the allocated costs, for at least for what they're receiving, are going up at a higher rate, if you will, than the revenues that the streets fund is receiving. So they're sort of losing ground in that respect.
So is this a different allocated costs?
Again, allocated costs are those that information systems, for example, they charge the streets fund because they have people who use computers, right? So they charge them for the cost for the annual replacement and maintenance of computers, the overall infrastructure, the network system. They're charged for a portion of that. To the extent they have vehicles, if Motor Pool will charge them for the maintenance of those vehicles, for the replacement of those vehicles when they're due for replacement. Risk management charges them based on the exposures related to liability and workers' comp claims. So all those allocations are come out of those internal service funds, and they go to the streets fund as well as everywhere else in the city. Everybody gets charged some portion of those services, and they just go up more than they have been going up more than the revenues that the streets fund is generating each year on a rate basis.
Okay, and do these so the net operating fund balance? None of these are taking into account deferred maintenance, or the roads that we're not fixing, and how that cost may be more than linear?
Mr. Chairman, Committee Member Dominguez, so you described that pretty accurately at the work session. If you were to do an accrual-based accounting of what's the cost to maintain these things, it's at an unfunded portion, it would be a much bigger number. This is really just a cash basis, the difference between money going out each year and money coming in.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember White, do you have any questions? Okay. Can you tell me more about the historical level of effort for storm drain cleaning? You mentioned that virtually nothing's being done now. What used to be done? What is a best practices level of maintenance for storm drains?
Well, based on all the memories that we have in with the people we have right now, it wasn't very much that was done, and the practices that we're hearing that are even done now, and the folks that have been there been there a long time, because many of the streets folks have been there quite a long time, that we just haven't done that effort, or we've had to borrow equipment to do it.
Mm-hmm. So really, historically, the way that system cleaned itself was with El Nino storms every 20 years, flushing everything out.
Or a response to it gets clogged, and then we're going out and dealing with it. It's more of a reaction to an event.
Okay. So it's not really a big cost driver in this equation, in this conversation. It's not a big deferred maintenance item that is looming as something. Well, I see Ms. Bjork shaking her head. Yes, it is.
The deferred maintenance is about mainly about the corrugated metal that many of the drainage system that is out there, and so the metal is, although it's a bonderized or it's a galvanized, when the water sits in that bottom of that pipe,
it rusts.
Eventually it'll rust out, and then the storm drain becomes partly earthened, and then that creates a lot of sediment into the creek, and then eventually in the ocean as well. Mm-hmm.
And Chair Hart, committee members, as you are aware, we have programmatic programs for our pipeline replacement for water and sewer. We have no such program for our storm drains. And in fact, we have had, to my knowledge, virtually no infrastructure replacement or repair of storm drains except on an emergency basis. We've had very little to no planned work in that area. So there is a big exposure there.
So in a perfect world, it would be similar to wastewater or water, and you'd have a 1% replacement schedule per year, something on that order of magnitude. How old is this system compared to water and wastewater?
Again, we are gathering information as we go. Some of the system dates back. It mirrors the age of the community. Although I must say that the early community infrastructure generally did not include as much storm drain as we might have preferred, and streets were used for conveyance. So I would say that most of it's probably 60, 70 years old at a minimum and older. Not much is going to be newer than that. So it's at the end of its useful life. The other issue, as Mr. Dayton said, is that it's a different type of material that doesn't actually last as well as some of our other pipeline materials. It's more subject to oxidation.
Councilmember White.
Thank you. How many miles of storm drain do we have?
We have that data, and I'm not that familiar with it at this point. I really would rather get an answer back to you. Yeah,
sort of
thank you.
250 is the number that we kind of throw out there for water and sewer.
And I believe it's less than that, but I don't know the amount.
But just, that would be good to know.
We can get it.
And is the current state of the art to line those pipes now as a way to maintain them?
There are technologies for that. It's corrugated, so that makes the lining technologies that we use usually are looking for a smooth pipe, and the corrugation makes a difficulty. But there certainly are in place technologies that you can do for some of the pipes, depending on the size of them and the condition. And I can't tell you what we would need to do on our infrastructure because we've had fairly limited efforts to the maintenance of it, let alone the management of the capital.
So what is step one of getting a handle on all this? Is it videotaping all the existing
I think
pipes?
This past year was a good step one. We had a very planned and programmatic approach to cleaning of the storm drains. As Mr. Dayton indicated, we did retain a Vector truck that had been retired from the wastewater service. So that was used in the collection system crews, trained the street crews to use that truck, and there was some videotaping and some camera inspection of storm drains. But the step one is getting the assessment of the condition of the asset, and then evaluating the infrastructure for its vulnerability, and then prioritizing it against all the other priorities. What's the priority of that versus the other priorities for the capital money? So it's putting all of that together in a matrix to come up with our top priorities for funding.
So are you adequately resourced in the budget to do the evaluation of the system, or is that something that needs money?
At this point in time, we could probably do the evaluation. The concern is that we know we have no money to fund the maintenance or repair of the system. And so the money that we use on evaluation really needs to be looked at, the timeliness of that, because that money, that the evaluation is somewhat a point in time, and you want to have an evaluation that informs the decisions you're making about what you're going to fund. So doing the evaluation now when we don't have funding to do any work doesn't make as much sense as doing the evaluation when we do have funding, because things may have changed.
Right, I understand that. But there does need to be a way to get a handle on it.
Absolutely.
In some order of magnitude. Yep. Otherwise, we don't have a good case to
get
the money.
That is some work that we need to do.
How long is that? How long will that take?
Mr. Toth isn't here today because he's on vacation. When he gets back, I will ask him that.
Okay.
I know he's been looking into that issue.
Future. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Councilmember Dominguez?
Thank you. Two questions. One, the slide primary streets funding sources on page 7. It indicates the 3 major sources. Is that fairly typical for cities our size or for cities in California, or do they have different models?
Yeah, I think it's pretty typical. I'm not sure that every city is allocating a portion of their utility users taxes or something that, which is a general tax. So we may be somewhat unique in that regard, but for the most part, we know if there's a lot of cities have a transportation sales tax or countywide. Gas tax monies are for this purpose. In fact, they're restricted for this purpose. So, but otherwise, I think we're pretty consistent with other communities.
Aren't we the only city in the county that has a utility users tax?
Yeah, but I'm talking about across the state. There may be other communities who are saying we're going to allocate some general tax revenues to the streets operation.
Councilmember Dominguez and Chair Hart, we did look at that information. I don't have it here today, but we'll bring that next time. We are fairly, as Mr. Samario indicated, not everyone has a utility users tax, but and that's a great source of funding for this infrastructure. we're fairly normally funded for our streets based on street mile, but we do have some data comparing us to other agencies, and we'll bring that next time.
So if they don't have this source and it's 56%, do they just have a smaller streets budget, or do they have an alternative source of funding?
There are a couple things. One, they may, you run the gamut. If you take Santa Monica, for example, they have significantly more funding per road mile than we do. And then it depends on the age of the infrastructure. And being an older city, that's one of the issues that we're facing. But again, I need to go back to that data because we did not bring that today, and we can bring that next time.
Yeah, that would be really helpful to benchmark that amongst, like cities and as a comparison, funding sources and expenditures. It probably is a fairly significant work effort to get at this core versus non-core in comparison to other cities. That's the issue. It's kind of subjective as to how you define that, and I'm sure each individual city probably categorizes things differently, so there's going to be a lot of noise in that information, but it would be helpful to compare.
The second question was, have we looked at the impact of certain things like, say, growth, either population growth or, say, hotel occupancy growth? Would those impact these costs or these revenues one way or another, or would they be would they just track? So in other words, would our infrastructure require a lot more maintenance or a lot less maintenance depending on increases in population or decreases in population?
On the cost side or the revenue side?
Either or.
Well, on the cost side, we're a fairly built-out city, so we're maintaining what we have, but we also have, having said that, we also have, the council's given us direction to have like high-quality sidewalks and build new ones, and then there's also the landscape that goes with that in the right-of-way, so that would be the marginal expansion, but we're largely a built-out city, so we're not building new streets regularly like maybe other growing cities are doing, and that is the lion's share, the bulk of our expenses in maintenance.
And just to add to that, we are a tourist destination, so as those numbers go up and down, we do have greater impacts on our streets and sidewalks, but none of the revenues we get that are tourist-related, sales tax, bed taxes primarily affect what we get here. These are UUT, they're utility-related, so they're going to be pretty stable. And then Measure A, that's the only one that would say potentially has some variability based on sales taxes, and if you will, that could be tied to tourism. But gas tax is just based on population. So maybe a little bit based on tourism, the volume of tourism and impacts, but for the most part, more stable.
Councilmember White?
Thank you. And this would be really Mr. Hart's bailiwick here as much as anything. The SBCAG gets, part of what we're seeing here is a portion of the SBCAG funding stream. And yet and pieces are missing. And what I'm looking for is the piece where is it STIP money or other sources of money that are coming into SBCAG and that are being allocated to Highway 101 at this point, but which could, if there were 7 votes, be reallocated to streets and such like. Comes in having that general ability to use, but are getting locked down into that second tier of Highway 101 funding. We have either today or whenever else we're talking about this, can we learn about that a little more? Even understanding that we don't have the control over that, but at least it's technically that money could be used for those purposes should the will be there.
The funding I think you're referring to is the Regional State Transportation Improvement Program, which is RSTP, and that was a pass-through, population-based monies that SBCAG passes through to local agencies, and it's a pretty small amount. We can get you the exact dollar figures of what it means to us, but it's every 2 years that it comes with the State Transportation Improvement Program. And that money is being held by the SBCAG board just in case there are funding that the freeway needs or the Measure A program as a whole That over time is about $50 million over the 30-year strategic plan for Measure A. And so that's being held in case that money is needed to, and then the board has a policy to release that when they don't. So it's really dependent upon whether that happens or not. If 7 members of the SBCAG board wanted to do that, that'd be great.
It can happen. And with all of these pie charts, there's nothing that's kind of rain that comes in from an unknown cloud on, at least as far as these charts are concerned. And isn't the number substantially larger than, did you say 50 million for 101? Isn't the number for the next chunk? There's 140 that's committed by the whole structure of Measure A to Highway 101. Isn't there another chunk that's pretty darn substantial?
I think you're talking there about the State Transportation Improvement Program, which is not the regional share, that is passed through to the locals, but it's the one that goes to SBCAG for regional transportation projects. An example of that might be an interchange. The roundabout at Cliff and Las Positas was a state transportation improvement program. So the South County's STIP money is being held for Measure A projects, largely the 101 widening project. So we don't see any of those monies. We would not have seen any of those monies, so it's hard to find a comparison. But if there are any city regional projects that need to be done over the Measure A 30-year period, there won't be monies to do those because our priority is the 101.
And so one of the ones that did get funding for that is the roundabout, is the Las Positas roundabout?
Las Positas roundabout is an older, I think it's the 1996 STIP project.
Okay.
But that's that flavor of money that we're talking about.
Okay, so it's regional projects that are then the money is being diverted to
on the regional system.
Rather than paving money.
Yeah, because the priority for infrastructure has been placed on the 101.
Right.
And that comes from the state.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful to have all that, and we can get super fine-grained into about all those other funding sources. But I think the key pie chart in this issue for the context is the allocation of Measure A. I think it's slide 17 that shows 13% of all the money goes to Highway 101 widening, and the other slide that follows it, which is 74% of the money that's allocated to South County, goes to local streets and transportation improvements. That was the deal that was, put together to get Measure A passed, was making that kind of allocation. And just for some context, if we did benchmark this transportation sales tax measure with others around the state, a more typical percentage is in the 30% range for local streets and roads, 30% for highways, and 30% for alternative transportation. So our county is a big outlier in that sense, dedicating such an incredible percentage toward local streets as opposed to highways. Councilmember Dominguez?
Thank you. So the two charts I'm curious to see more historical data on is the history of gas tax revenues, or I guess the total. You show us the actual and projected revenues, and it looks like it's declining in 2014 from 2.879 to projected in 2017 1.863, so about $1 million difference there. And that's 16% of our primary streets funding sources, at least as of this year. How has that been looking back like 10 or 20 years? Has our gas tax as a percentage or as an absolute number, has it always kind of been in that range, or is this a pretty dramatic? I mean, was there 3.8 at one point?
The gas tax is based on a gallon per gallon tax. So as gas prices go up and as the inflation goes up for all costs, the cost of oil to put on the roads, to the materials that go on the road, the labor to maintain the roads, that's all going up. But the gas tax we're receiving is not going up because it's a flat tax per gallon. And then the other thing that's happening is that we're actually seeing a decline in driving. The millennial generation is not driving as many miles. That combined with electric vehicles and higher or lower, higher mileage vehicles, so they pay less. So like a Tesla is not paying for the use of the road. Maybe on Measure A, if they're spending money for sales tax, we get some of that. But for the gas tax, they're cut out of the equation. And some of the things that the state's talking about remedying this situation is doing a vehicle miles traveled tax. And there's actually there has been a pilot program in Oregon. There's one in California that's supposed to be initiating. But that is the story for gas tax is diminishing over time. And that has been going on for a long time, for decades.
And there's nothing we can do locally to combat that. It would have to be Sacramento.
That's correct.
Do we keep track of gas sales in the city? Do we know has more gas been sold or less gas been sold and what that trend looks like?
Yeah, we don't keep track of the number, like gallons sold in the city. We just know what the taxable sales are for the various gas stations in town. But yeah, so we don't keep track of the actual gallons sold. I know the state does because that's how the basis for allocations of some of the money we're seeing.
Would that be a proxy for miles traveled within the city, or do we keep data through other traffic signal measurement devices?
Well,
the miles traveled, we deduce with our traffic model based on the counts that we're taking on the street and where people are coming and going to. And actually, the state is going to be starting to ask us to keep track of traffic using that number, the vehicle miles traveled, and so we're going to have to up our game as an agency to decipher what that number is. And our traffic modeling results that will be coming to council hopefully in the next 3 months will begin to tell that story.
Thank you.
Any other questions or any other information that committee members would like staff to work on before the next presentation? So at some point, are you going to bring us back information about, PCI? You've done this before, just to kind of remind us. And Councilmember Dominguez is new to the conversation on some of these issues, so there needs to be a little more going back on covering that. And in doing that in comparison to the other neighboring cities, I think is useful. That whole, what are other cities doing to achieve different PCI and allocate resources in a different way is, I think, important for this conversation. So,
okay, we can do that.
Okay, there's no other questions. Is there anybody that wants to speak from the public? Bonnie, did you want to say anything? Put you on the spot. That's okay if you don't. You didn't put a speaker slip in, but I don't think we have any speaker slips. All right. If you're going to talk, you do have to come up to the microphone. You don't have to talk, but if you want to talk, you have to talk on the microphone. We just need you on the microphone because we're on TV.
It might even be an unanswerable question. I don't know. But the questions regarding diversion of funds, or not diversion, but application of funds from Measure A, from the freeways, that's an interesting concept. But then I recoil a bit because I'm so anxious to see the freeway completed. I don't know on a scale of 1 to 10 if I am more anxious about the freeway, though, than I am about our befuddled infrastructure. And really, the storm drain, and all of this. I have the first book of ordinances at home that my great-grandfather wrote, and it would be interesting to see if there's any mention of placement of stuff like that. But that aside, I would hope that you would peel the onion even further than the consideration of a 7-0 vote to reallocate Measure A funds from the freeway. Would really like to see you peel the onion away from what is a little, I mean, this is going to be hard to explain to the general public. This entire presentation, as brilliant as it is, we need to simplify where it's even remotely possible to divert from one, I can't think off the top of my head right now, but from one area to another, just, 100,000 here or 50,000 there, and just keep going and going and going and see what you come up with. And, it's hard for the public to do a line item evaluation because we can't see the whole onion, I mean, it's hard to see what lies underneath. So this is very interesting, and I'm looking forward to some progress in this area, and thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I think that's exactly our challenge, is explaining this very, very complicated thing to the public in a way that makes sense and pointing toward a path that will help address it. That's our job. Any other comments or questions? All right, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.